the CEO of EnterpriseDB, the Enterprise Postgres company. This here is Ed Boyajian, and he's going to give us a wonderful presentation on a comparison of MySQL and Postgres, what you should know.
Great, thank you, Eric. Good to be here. Nice to have a chance to talk to you all. My name is Ed Boyajian. I'm the CEO of EnterpriseDB. So my special thanks to Eric for inviting us to talk to the MySQL user group about Postgres. The original title of this discussion was going to be why Postgres is better than MySQL. But in light of the environment we find ourselves in, we softened the message in the title, but maybe not the words that I speak. So, and we also thankful to our hosts here at Oracle for having the meeting here and giving us a chance to come and present to you. Let me give you a little bit about my background, then I'll let my colleagues introduce themselves. I'm sure you'll be interested to know who's here with me. I came to EnterpriseDB in June of 2008. And prior to that, I'd spent about 6.5 years at Red Hat, where I was most recently running the North American business operations for the company. If you look back at Red Hat, you actually go back, from middle of 2008 and go back 6.5 years from that point in time. That was the very early stages of the launch of Red Hat. In fact, when I got to Red Hat, we just launched Red Hat Enterprise Linux. So we were beginning to move away from the Red Hat Linux product, which you might remember was, for those of you, how many of you are familiar with Red Hat Linux? The old version was a CD. We had installer technology, packaged it in a box, $99 at CompUSA. I think the company was a public company then, but it was a pretty small public company. And if you go back that far, those were really the early days of not just evangelizing Linux. That was, that was hard work in and of its own right, but we were also in the evangelizing open source, evangelizing the GPL and open source licensing, evangelizing subscription-style business models, among other things. So in those days, pretty heavy lifting and a different time in the open source world. Through my experience at Red Hat, we were finding increasingly companies who were solving infrastructure spend problems and operating system and middleware using open source, continue to raise their hand and say, we got to solve our database spend problem. We're not satisfied with the status quo. We got more of our wallet share going to fewer vendors. It's a $20 billion industry. As you all probably know, 3 vendors own about 95% of that industry. Oracle's about 50%, and then Microsoft and IBM about equal share in the low 20s. So they were complaining about that problem. We weren't solving it at Red Hat at that time. And my view of that was that there was an opportunity to create in and around the database market a similar phenomenon that had been created around operating the system and middleware. I also made a judgment, and this will be interesting to some of you, that while MySQL had done a terrific job penetrating a new area of the market, particularly around dynamic languages, scripting languages like PHP, in terms of commercial success, it really wasn't approaching the market opportunity around traditional relational workloads, and wasn't positioned well technically to do it like Postgres was. So I had a bit of an edge because for those of you who ever followed Red Hat's history, back in the day we had a database offering that never really went anywhere, but it was a Postgres-based database offering. So I had a little bit of insight beyond kind of superficial knowledge about Postgres technology. So my view was customers and enterprise users needed a database alternative from an open source vendor. Postgres had strong presence. It did things that MySQL didn't do. And that by bringing a business operation in support of the technology and the community around Postgres, we could actually create an interesting business and an interesting value for customers. That's what we're going to talk about tonight. Just a couple other points on that. If you go back in that, I come from, most of my technical credentials are with Red Hat. I was in another open source company that Red Hat acquired, RS Digita, which many, if you guys ever followed the ACS community system, I was there. Red Hat bought that. We never actually turned that into much of a product. So, I like to say I wasn't just drinking the open source Kool-Aid, I was serving the open source Kool-Aid. And Red Hat stays to this day true to their open source roots. It's one of the very things that attracted me to Postgres, because in that way, it's very unlike MySQL. And we're going to talk about that. It isn't controlled by a commercial entity, and I think that's a good thing. Let me let my 2 colleagues who are with me tonight just introduce themselves quickly.
How you doing? I'm Jim Oljenski. I'm the Chief Architect at EnterpriseDB. Been with the company since the beginning, since day one. Been a pretty wild ride, especially as Ed and Karen came on board in order to show us how to take a good technology and turn it into a real business model.
Great.
So hi, I'm Karen Teagan-Padir, and I run products and marketing at EnterpriseDB. Previously, I was at Sun Microsystems, and I ran the MySQL and middleware community, including identity management and Glassfish.
So Karen just joined us in the past 4 weeks. So she didn't join the mothership. Sorry that if Larry's listening. Very sorry. We got her. You didn't. But we're delighted to have her. And so for those of you who've been, strong followers of MySQL, you may have heard Karen speak. She's been quite active in the MySQL community, along with her roots at Sun, working on Java. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Postgres versus MySQL. I'm not going to lie. I'm going to give you a biased view, but I'll try to be reasonable in my biased view about the technology. And I will point this out immediately. I'm not a technologist, so I'm going to talk more about the community, the business attributes, and I got guys like Jim and Karen to keep me out of trouble when I start to make heroic claims about the technology that aren't entirely true. So why Postgres? So for those of you who don't know, how many of you are familiar with Postgres and have a sense of the size of Postgres, the community around Postgres, the use of Postgres? Okay, so I'll assume, close to half of you. Here's what people don't know. Postgres is remarkably prolific. For those of you who stuck around open source long enough, you kind of know that when open source databases are talked about, they always talk about two, MySQL and Postgres. MySQL clearly has enjoyed the wave of popularity that Postgres hasn't, but that doesn't mean Postgres hasn't become prolific. It's really important to note, if you look at one of the metrics, we estimate roughly 9 million annual downloads of Postgres per year. How does that happen? Some of it comes from the community, a lot of it comes from EnterpriseDB now, and a great majority of it comes because it's attached to every Linux distribution out there. Both the commercial versions, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, SLES, OpenSUSE, Fedora, all create a Postgres distro as part of their release. A lot of users of Postgres, in fact, get it from their Linux distributor. So remarkably prolific. And you start to see, if you look, just get a sense of some of the companies. There's literally thousands of companies today that use Postgres. One of the, Eric and I were talking earlier, one of the things that comes up often, and we hear this, Eric mentioned it, is, it's not, I think Postgres is a superior technology, but it's just harder to find Postgres people. So we think that phenomenon's changing. We think it's changing kind of fast, and I'll talk about why that is. But it gives you some basic grounding. Those of you who looked at the technology understand this. Postgres features typically designed more in the like of Oracle, DB2, and SQL Server, fully transactional, ACID compliant, and the guys in the community like to talk about Postgres as probably the most truly SQL standard compliant of any relational database. That's actually not just a trivial statement from a community perspective. The guys in the community put a lot of their effort and energy in ensuring the SQL standard is adhered to. And I think that's actually a little bit of a theme you'll hear come later. Performance. Postgres has long been known for performance around vertical scaling, multiple cores, multiple CPUs, and has won favor because of those attributes, particularly when compared to the bigger proprietary technologies. Also in the arena of concurrent users, Postgres gets a lot of check marks when you hold it up against those. And then separately, in the world of geospatial, also an area where Postgres is kind of well known.
Just a quick question: does that mean that it doesn't scale as well horizontally?
No, that doesn't mean it doesn't mean that. So okay. I think if you held up horizontal scalability between Postgres and MySQL today, they're much closer than people would perceive them to be. What we would tell you is that neither of them scale horizontally as well as we would like today. But I think very similar. Jimmy, you want to add any comment to that?
No, that's absolutely right. You can scale horizontally. You got built-in replication similar to MySQL. You have layers over top of it that intelligently load balance across the databases. But you're not going to see something like an Oracle RAC out of an open source type thing today. You're not going to see the DB2 scalability as well, scaling up horizontally. And it's not a NoSQL database like a Mongo or a Couch. It's meant to be a traditional relational database that scales up very, very well to There are 32, 64, 96 cores with thousands of concurrent users. That's what it was built to do, designed to do. And the horizontal scalability is the more traditional replication, and that works pretty well.
Great, thanks. Architecture, so the technology's been geared to enterprise developers who are focused on enterprise-style applications. You know, it doesn't mean that PHP developers don't write apps that run on Postgres. They do. In fact, a vast majority do today. But it really was designed for guys that write traditional enterprise apps with transactions. You know, arguably today the standard for that category of app is Oracle. You know, with 50% market share, it's hard to argue that Oracle is what people pick most often. We'll talk about where Postgres fits in that in a minute. And it's a database with a unified architecture and storage engine. And so this is an attribute that many companies that pick Postgres like over MySQL, for example. The fact that there's no need to bolt technologies together, which feels uncomfortable to many architects when picking a database. Postgres, from its beginnings, was designed with this transactional capability and a storage engine built in. Now we know that in the MySQL world, people will debate the merits, advantages, and disadvantages of multiple storage engines. You know, our view of the world and the community's view of the world around Postgres is having this built into the technology actually enables us to do more with the technology than we could do when you abstract those two parts. So any surprises here for anybody about the basic breadth of Postgres? I haven't spent as much time talking about all of it as we could, but it gives you kind of an overview on where Postgres is. So here's some interesting survey results from last year, about this time, a little later than right now, in May of 2009, the Eclipse developer survey that came out, asked the developers who typically develop using Eclipse tools, when you deploy, what database do you pick? So some interesting truths here. It's not particularly surprising that 27% and 27% picked Oracle or MySQL. Not particularly surprising. What you may find surprising is the next most prolific database chosen was Postgres at 9.9%. If you go inside the data a little bit more, what you find is that for Java and C developers, they tend to pick Oracle. Your PHP developers, you tend to pick MySQL. And Postgres is more picked by the same group of people who pick Oracle-style databases. I think one important thing to note, you know, if you went back a year ago, this was maybe a more interesting conversation. Maybe you'd argue it's more interesting now. Here's what I tell you. Things have changed dramatically. Postgres is still completely independent. We think, when you talk about this from an open source context, we think that's an advantage for the user. We believe that at our core, as opposed to, you know, the new monolith, which includes both technologies under one corporate, kind, benevolent corporate environment. I'm not allowed to say that. At some point, did they actually make me leave? So, any surprises? Does this surprise you? I'll be honest, it surprised me when I saw this. I've been at EnterpriseDB for a while, and you certainly see the merit of Postgres and the customers we deal with, but caught me by surprise that this many pick. And notice it's also had a DB2, SQL Server, and other.
Yeah, I was going to say, if that survey was not focused on Eclipse developers, you might get
a different outcome,
results,
of course.
Right?
But Eclipse is a pretty prolific community, prolific
yeah,
tool,
no, I meant
set.
the .NET folks.
I totally agree. Totally agree. Do they really matter? I mean, seriously. You know what? That's another. But we do that when we go out to Redmond. That's when we make that pitch. They just haven't invited us yet. I don't know why.
They're not as benevolent as we are.
All right, so here's some job growth trends. So Eric, this gets to your question today. You know, this is anyone can go look at these stats on Indeed.com. I find it interesting to do when we look at kind of job history. You notice Postgres growth. You know, let's consider this a proxy for some progress for Postgres. So we're kind of glad to see this. In absolute terms, the number of Postgres DBAs is a lot lower than the number of MySQL DBAs. A point worth noting. But the demand for Postgres talent is growing, and we start to see that increase now, certainly in inbound inquiry. For people who use MySQL as for technology's sake, we don't see necessarily people starting to move. We see it in certain areas where people have OEM'd the technology and are concerned about what happens now. So that's not the place we see people beginning to make the jump. But I think what we're starting to find is that as people are starting to plan for what open source database are they going to put in their infrastructure. Remember, I go back Red Hat 6-7 years. The open source was always used as a wedge strategy, at least in the early stages, a wedge strategy to create more balance in the IT infrastructure in terms of negotiating power for the buyer versus the vendor. And with the change in the ecosystem, we see some of that starting to tilt now towards Postgres. Postgres is a respected technology. People know about it. It's independent. And that fear that Postgres gets acquired, can't happen because it's an independent community. Like Linux is independent, like Eclipse is independent, and others. So an important phenomenon. I think one of the things that's leading that trending in jobs. How many of you have Postgres skills? Okay. And you being heavily recruited? Let me see. This should tell you if you're not, you might want to raise your hand again. There's people who might want you. So let's talk about open source development models, because I think this leads to an important and relevant discussion about what's different in the nature of the way a community builds. And we see this as an inherent advantage to what Postgres is able to do. On one hand, you've got technologies like Postgres, Apache, Eclipse, Linux. Those are brands. They're brands that are well known. They also happen to be brands that are not controlled by any commercial entity. Right? A really important point, those communities formed and they continue to thrive and exist independent of a commercial business. It doesn't mean commercial companies don't contribute or help, but it does mean that communities work independently. On the other side, you've got communities that were built up around a commercial business. There was a business started the community, the business manages the community. So if you look in these independent communities, you see a couple of common attributes. First, they're very large, active user populations, sometimes hundreds, sometimes thousands, in some cases tens of thousands of people participating, active in the community, as opposed to what you tend to find in communities that are led by corporate entities, where they're smaller, more insular communities. If you look in an open or independent community, you see meritocracy-based project leadership. Now, some people may say that's positive. Some people may say that's a negative. We view that as a positive. We think that the types of decisions and the type of motivation that's driven around this community-style leadership actually drives better outcomes and better results. In a closed community, it doesn't mean closed communities can't be effective here. It just means it's operating differently. That the priorities are driven by the business, and that may or may not relate directly to user needs and user interests. If it's good, it does. If it's not, it may not get there. And there's been, you guys have seen this story. Those of you who've been close to the MySQL community have seen the pain and pressure associated with community development when it's controlled by a company. And I know Karen won't speak on this topic, so I won't put her on the spot to speak on this topic in front of the rest of you. Unless she wants to.
Watch my keynote from the MySQL Users Conference last year.
Oh, that's good. I didn't know that. We should have put that up here. In an independent community, many external code contributors, and the tendency in the company control ones is fewer code contributors. We just think that limits the ability to generate code faster, to make the code better, and to create an overall better technology. I don't think it's a coincidence that Postgres, for those of you who know it and have looked at the technology, is viewed almost universally by people in the database world as a superior technology to MySQL. It's almost not debated today. Now, I know those of you who use MySQL, we could spend a lot of time making that debate today. We won't. But most will say we love Postgres more, but the ecosystem around Postgres isn't as strong. And I think that's one of the limitations that we find in this style model. We'll come back to that. Vibrant open source ecosystem. So we see a lot of ecosystem build up around the technologies, but one of the limitations in this style model is without a commercial influence, the community is focused on building good core technology. Not so much the socialization of that technology in and around other communities. We see this in Postgres. The guys who run the project, extraordinary technologists. In some ways, very much unlike Linux. Linux, in comparison to Postgres, kind of like a Wild West. I mean, things moving fast, a lot of people throwing code in, and this constant change happening. The Postgres community, in some ways, appropriately so, they're so focused on adhering to SQL standards. They're so focused on this database can't crash when it's under user demand, on thousands of concurrent users. So when we say it's our next release, it's got to be that good. And because of that, they're focused on the core technology, not the ecosystem. So tooling hasn't been typically as good. And we're going to talk a little bit about the role a company like EnterpriseDB has to play to help that community do even more. And I think you see a mix of this. MySQL, I would argue, has a great ecosystem around it. The popularity drove that, and even today. But other projects, not so much so, when you really look at the technologies. I mean, Ingress we talk about there as an open source project. That, I would say, arguably has a limited to non-existent ecosystem around it. All people ask us all the time, what about Ingress? We know they have a big customer base because they talk about it, but beyond that, and they've wrapped themselves in the cloak of open source, but that doesn't really make you, true community. Limited commercial influence. So, in the communities that are managed independently, companies like EnterpriseDB or others, we certainly have input to what happens in the community. We employ some of the key community guys. We don't get to decide what happens in the community. The team of people who run that project and make those decisions. We like to think if we see good opportunity, we can influence. You know how we influence most? We write the code and we contribute it. That's it. That's what the community cares about. You vote with your development, and we like that model. We think it's important. Put some bodies behind it and do the work. And the community thrives around that. I think, conversely, in that case, these are highly commercialized communities. And again, I don't think that makes them bad. I just think it changes the dimensions of motivations and how they evolve and emerge. And then I think one of the most important things, the QA associated with these independent communities is absolutely world class. Now, some would debate the features may not be as up to date, but I'll tell you this: the work that's done from that independent group of people around making sure the technology works hums. We've seen examples, and you've seen this example, and I know we've certainly heard it from people who are unsatisfied with other technologies like MySQL. The QA hasn't been handled as well. Because less people are independently motivated to participate, it becomes insular, and now you're just like a proprietary company, but not funded like a proprietary company.
I would agree that certainly from a functionality perspective that would contribute. Since you mentioned scalability and non-functional aspects of it, how do you handle that in these large communities? So testing for performance and scalability? Good question. So, it comes in a variety of ways. Imagine that the participants in these communities aren't just individuals, right? Let me use an example. NTT, Nippon Telephone and Telegraph, they're the AT&T of Japan, major community contributor in the Postgres world. They have their open source software center has, I want to say, over 100 people dedicated just to the success of open source development. Their motivation is to get that technology to proliferate inside their organization. I think they spend $80 million a year with Oracle. And I don't like spending $80 million a year. So, and it's not just Oracle, it's a whole bunch of other technologies. So they go to the trouble of actually making that contribution on the behalf of the community. They set up a whole, test and dev center. They run tests. They're not the only ones. Companies like EnterpriseDB do some of that. So there are groups who participate in the community who do that. And what you see, because people want to see these technologies succeed, they're happy to invest that money. They're investing it in themselves. That's the way they look at it, right? As opposed to I'll pay you to do it and trust you to do it on my behalf. And that's not a new phenomenon, right? That's now matured to a point that an organization like NTT, who I think happens to be a standard bearer in this area, has an open source software center. Think about that. Go back 10, I can tell you in the early days of Red Hat, forget about it. You couldn't find anybody who had that kind of interest, so much so that they invested to create, a center of excellence like that did that kind of testing. I wouldn't say it's commonplace, but it's easier to find now and around large enterprises than it ever was before. It's certainly true in the Linux space because the OS has become so relevant. All the hardware vendors have done some of the similar things in and around operating systems. Okay? Other questions or comments on this? I'm going to keep an eye on the clock. Okay, so let's just get an expert view on the nature of open source models.
So it's time to seriously review how MySQL Server is being developed and change the development model to be more like Postgres. So we trust the experts. This particular expert happened to be Monty, the founder of MySQL, and a comment he made last year. So we like that. You know, he's proud of the technology. As you all should be proud of the MySQL technology, but I think he saw some attributes similar to what we described here in the way Postgres gets developed. Did you guys ever read this quote before? You probably didn't expect me to put it up. So let's talk about community matters. Notice the play on words. There's a couple of things worth talking about Postgres that you may or may not know. So the license. So Postgres uses an OSI-approved license. It's the Postgres license, and it's similar to BSD or MIT. You know, very permissive license. You know, very few restrictions. It allows use and redistribution for any purpose, and there are no viral clauses. So unlike the GPL, you can take the technology and use it anywhere. What are the advantages and what are the disadvantages? Some of the advantages are, you know, for those, it comes really into copyright, but if you want to use the technology, if you want to make a fork of the technology or a derivative, you know, Green Plum, NetEase, Vertica, I'll miss some. You know, companies that have taken Postgres, created their branch or their fork of it, and made their own product. The advantage of that is there's an interesting spread of that technology because there's not an obligation, you know, because commercial entities can essentially privatize that technology. The disadvantage of that is that the good code work that they do isn't obligated to be given back to the community. So there's a double-edged sword to that. But the fact is, you know, those companies are still working from a technology base that started with Postgres. So in its own way, proliferates in a different way, but I think kind of interesting. On the copyright side, copyright is attributed to the Postgres Global Development Group, which isn't technically a legal entity. It's just a way of saying it's all contributors of Postgres. So there's no real legal entity there. And what that means, anyone can contribute, and you can maintain ownership of your work. You don't relinquish the ownership that way. You can keep that and use it for whatever you want at whatever point in time. As it relates to the Postgres distribution, you know, it's free for anybody to use. You know, so there's no copyright assignment, which has been, you know, we've heard this issue for anybody who writes on code, works on code for other projects that use the GPL. In this case, like MySQL. Project governance, I think, really important differentiation. Some would see this as potentially a negative. I see it as a positive. In the Postgres world, there's a core team of senior developers who lead the project. That core team consists of 7 people. There's no one lightning rod. You know, there are guys that are more prominent in one area of technology than another, but there's no one individual that stands kind of on top of the project that acts as the lightning rod and the kind of beacon for that project. You see that almost always in the commercially driven open source communities, but this is really, you know, behaves much more like a meritocracy. It doesn't mean there's not experts. There are very clear experts there, but there's not one person that drives that. So decision making by design and definition is consensus driven. And so ideas and issues get brought forward. And, you know, amazingly, this system, a lot of discussed open source models for development, this system works amazingly well. You know, shockingly good at vetting priorities and seeing to it that the right priorities emerge. I will tell you, it probably moves a little slower than a commercially driven system that's funded and, you know, with leaders banging on people's heads saying, get this thing done by this date. But interestingly, a community of independent people focused on success around similar general parameters do a pretty remarkable job turning up code in a reasonable amount of time that's of very, very high quality. The group is mainly concerned with resolving the long-running discussion. So when things kind of, you know, stay in some form of community malaise over some kind of reasonable person's measure of time, you guys jump in and say, okay, here's where we're going to go. You know, and people jump up and say, I'm in, let's go. Matters of discipline. You don't have discipline like you said the wrong thing, shame on you kind of discipline. Discipline like, are we maintaining the right quality standard for the code that's being written? You know, and that's handled in large degree by committers. You know, are we adhering to the SQL standard when we write an add-on to the technology? So very, very careful thought put into this around the community in this particular community. And then, you know, worried about schedule and overall direction, making sure things are generally picked effectively. There are really 3 groups of people around the Postgres community that you know, play an impact role. There's the core team of 7. There's a group of committers I think there's probably 15 to 20 committers that actually commit source to the project. And then there are contributors. There are, if you go to the website, you'll see there's 20, 30 or so what they call key contributors. These are guys who write a lot of the code. But you go beyond that, there are hundreds to thousands of people who are always playing with the technology, providing feedback. Some write code. The mail list have, I would say over 50,000 people associated with the various mailing lists. 50,000 would be a stretch to say all of those are active and contributing. But suffice it to say, thousands of people are participating, contributing. And that's something most people don't know. We like that aspect of what Postgres does well. So let me change gears a minute, because I think it's important. We've talked about the independent project, we've talked about the open source community, and there is a relevant role for a commercial entity. And I use this example from Red Hat. In many ways, Red Hat couldn't exist without Linux. Everybody knows that. But you got to look carefully at the evolution. Linux can't become what it is without a Red Hat associated with the technology. And so there's this kind of symbiosis that happens between commercial entity and independent project. And the role we see that we have to play relative to the Postgres community is to become an integral part of the community, to help the community deal with issues of commercialization that may matter. We can't control what Postgres community does, but we certainly can give insight and input based on commercial demand and commercial interest. What I will tell you about the experience at Red Hat, one of the most valuable things we could provide is Red Hat, as we acquired more and more customers, we became a very natural converge point for feature needs and demands that were vetted, from a true commercial perspective. That helped influence the roadmap for Linux in many, many ways. And so it didn't define all of the things that were going on in the Linux community, but it certainly helped give structured feedback to community members about what commercial users cared about. Left alone, it's hard to get that structured input, that structured feedback. And that's one of the important roles that the commercial entity plays. So, part of it is, we're motivated around running a business, so we don't hide that fact. And our motivation is to help Postgres become disruptive in the industry. In some ways, we saw MySQL do that. I think in absolute terms, in a $20 billion industry, here's what I tell you. No database vendors made an impact. You compare that to operating system market, where today Linux enjoys roughly 17 to 20%, depending on whose study you believe, of an $8 billion market. And if you look at the J2EE middleware market, and you stay focused on the J2EE platform, out of a $2.5 billion market, about 25% of that's now consumed by open source technology. Two things that are compelling about that. The pies didn't get bigger year on year, partly because open source kept them from growing because of the cost differences. And more companies, are voting with real dollars and decisions to use open source technologies. But you look in the $20 billion database market, and it's arguably less than 1% in absolute terms. So it's still a huge opportunity for that industry to change. By the way, very similar to those other markets in that, there's a standards basis for the technology, right? If you looked at, POSIX, Unix, Linux, skills transportability, in the operating system market, you look at J2EE standards environment, which is actually, a true standard. And so, yet another opportunity where an open source technology can come in and begin to make an impact. The database market is another one. What's disabled that is the inherent nature of the way applications work with databases, and with procedural languages and the way applications now are tied directly to the database, it makes it really hard to make those changes. What companies are saying more and more is it's time to start thinking about how do we make those changes. Because in this economy, I would say in any economy, but especially in this economy, 60 to 65% of all software spends in infrastructure. The three-legged stools, operating system, middleware, database is more than twice as big as the other two. So this is heresy in this building, but I'll say it. So we talked about Postgres, healthy and growing. Our business is healthy and growing. I came a year and a half ago as a much smaller company focused on a little bit of a different priority. We now, we've just crossed our 500th customer. And a real focus on best practice understanding of how do you use Postgres. So it kind of gets at Eric's question. Okay, I'd love to use Postgres, but I don't think I can find people who can help me. Well, we hold our hands up and say we're one of the companies who can help you.
Is that your core business model around consultancy?
Not consultancy. We'll come to that in a minute. it's one of the things we do, but I wouldn't call it the core. Our management team comes from a combination of now Sun and Red Hat for most of the part. So, you know, we're borrowing some of the insights and learnings from those environments and bringing them here. And proud to say that the strength of those open source roots really matter to the culture of our company. We view our role as one that has to be supportive of the independence of Postgres while we're finding a way to help customers use Postgres. You know, our investors, you know, companies, you know, will ask, okay, so, you know, is Postgres have, you know, the real credentials to get there, and companies like EnterpriseDB do it. In addition to the financial investors, we have venture funds who invest in the company. IBM is invested in EnterpriseDB. Red Hat is invested in EnterpriseDB. NTT is invested in EnterpriseDB. All have kind of, you know, not only voted with, you know, their kind of words that they support the interests of EnterpriseDB. They've made tangible investments to see to it that Postgres as a community and the work we do on behalf of the community continues to be a success. Really important point that commercial entities associated with our company are throwing in and pledging their support for the community through us. You know, and again, that's hard to execute on. If you're these guys and you want to see Postgres succeed, how do you do that with the independent community? It's not so easy to figure out how you do that. Hire people, you know, send money to the .org foundation and hope this gets spent in the right way. Tough to do. You need somebody in the middle who's going to actually care about the interests of the community and what it can bring to these other companies. So important baseline. So to get to your question, I'm sorry, your name?
Amir.
Amir? Mm-hmm. Amir, thank you. We productize several ways. So if you follow open source products, this is a page out of the Red Hat playbook. We take the core, what Postgres community version, we bundle that as Postgres Plus. That's our product family. It includes, it is, you know, synchronized. It's not a fork from the community code. And we add certain packages, we certify, test, and you get it as a subscription. So you get a guaranteed SLA. We love people to go use Community Edition Postgres. Let me be clear about that. We think that's an excellent choice for many companies. The challenge is some say, I don't, you know, the email support I get through mail lists, you know, can be very good and sufficient for my needs. The problem is, if I'm running a production database and I got to know I get somebody, I can't rely on that. And that's where it crosses over and they say, you know what, I'll take an SLA with you guys for that. You know, the prices are, you know, tiny in comparison to proprietary databases. So that's a role we play. Pull that off, we certify our release. We add some packaging and some interesting technologies to make it easier to use, manage, deploy than what you get just from the pure community. And to that end, one of the things we've done for the community is create simple installation tools. So the one-click install is for those of you who use Postgres. If you get the one-click installer version, you get that from EnterpriseDB. The community didn't want to do that work. We threw in, we got 4 or 5 guys who do nothing but that installer work all the time, every day. Keep it up to date, make sure it works. You know, that's a contribution to the community. We don't get any, there's no real dollars that comes out of that for EnterpriseDB, but that's a pure give back to the community, but one we think is important for commercial customers. And then we sell package services around that and training so that we can begin to build an ecosystem of certified DBAs, developers, and architects around Postgres. We think it's really, and again, here's another example. Who ensures that the skill set is professionalized around Postgres if there's not a commercial entity? It's tough. Community doesn't, that's not what the community cares about. We care a lot about that. You know, you think about the relevance of what a Red Hat certified engineer has become. You know, it actually means you're a Red Hat certified engineer, you actually can go make more money with that certification. And I wouldn't say we're there with our Postgres certification yet, but that's the path we're working towards. How am I doing on time?
You're fine.
Okay. Oh, there we go. Oh. So let me just, see, this is, you know, I made one too many Oracle comments. Mothership, they got all kind, I don't know, they got microphones in here. What's that? Somebody came in, I got a little dart in my neck. Who we serve. You think about that in the context. Come on, guys, you're a little fun. You know, think about that two areas. The left-hand side are companies who have an existing database, and on the right-hand side, companies who are writing new applications. This gives you a little snapshot in the style, the business that we serve and who we see raising their hand for Postgres. You know, candidly, we don't see a lot of people who come in and say, I'm going to rip and replace my Oracle or any other database. That's not the typical use case. What people say is, I've got a project. It sits alongside my current database. I want to learn about Postgres. I want to augment my database. We'll talk about some use cases. You know, I want to create an operational data store, and I will replicate from Oracle to Postgres, or I'll replicate from DB2 to Postgres, and I'll run my BI and reporting against that database and save a few bucks. You know, we see that as more of a central place where Postgres comes in early. And then there's just thousands of existing Postgres users who to date have not been able to push the technology forward because there wasn't a commercial entity or somebody who could help them deal with the kind of normal problems you get into when you start deploying a database more broadly. We do a wide range of new application work. So if you're writing a new app, it's a great time because anybody can pick any database. We see more and more interesting in the OEM and the embedded space. Companies are saying, you know what, I'm going to use Postgres now. It serves my needs. Price performance is excellent. So we get business there. And more, we see Postgres invited into the new replatforming happening around virtualized and cloud environments. And so, you know, kind of a host of companies who are starting now to pick Postgres first.
In terms of Amazon, over the last year, they've greatly expanded the number of predefined machine images that they have available. Is Postgres now part of their predefined image?
It is, yeah. We were just having a quick debate about that with Amazon tonight because they're a little hard to find. So we're working on that problem with our friends at Amazon.
But they're there.
They're there. And, you know, by popular demand, Amazon, while they have their relational database service, which is based on MySQL, you know, they have a variety of other AMIs, you know, from almost every other database vendor. You know, a lot of people have come to us and Amazon and said, get Postgres here. You know, again, community won't work on a project like that, but that's a project we'll pick up. So if you give Jimmy or one of us your card, we'll make sure you can find it. Yeah. So one of the technical underpinnings of our products, and this technology was really, the original thesis of EnterpriseDB was around a layer of compatibility technology. And the idea was, you know, the lock-in that happens between an application and the database is in a growing way unattractive to the user population. So the original founders of the company started the business not so much around Postgres, but around making applications easy to migrate from specifically Oracle, and in this case to Postgres. They picked Postgres, and so this layer of compatibility technology enables you to migrate an app without changing, you know, any of the underlying code. So the actual stored procedures, the triggers and functions, you know, don't need to be written to run that app on Postgres. So really important technology in the early stages of the company, still important in EnterpriseDB today, and a lot of the reason companies pick Postgres Plus is so that they can have access to this as they think about what deployment model they want to use and what things they want to change and how they want to save money in their infrastructure going forward. And to put that in some perspective, there's certain aspects of migrations that you don't save any money on. The areas that you do save money on, you know, there's always a little bit of work that has to go into migrating an app, but you start to see pretty massive savings happen when you look at how those apps migrate over, particularly in application modification, unit testing, integration testing, and the like. So let me have Jimmy talk about a couple of case studies since he worked closely with these guys, and I think give you some insight on who uses Postgres, why they use it, and how they use it.
So the FAA, they about a year and a half ago, they started looking at replatforming some of their database applications, specifically their NOTAM system, which is their Notice to Airman system, of putting out alerts to pilots about runways being closed. It could be a drop zone for some parachutes coming down, so this way they know not to fly in that particular area. Highly specialized type of application that uses geospatial technology. And they did a pretty independent search of all the different database technologies out there. They're an Oracle shop. They looked at Oracle, Postgres, MySQL, DB2. They looked at them all. And they ended up going with Postgres, really because it was a technical winner overall when it comes to geospatial technology. And that comes a lot of it from the open source community. Not just the Postgres core community. The way Postgres is designed, it has the ability to add on additional modules very easily. And it's a project called PostGIS that becomes part of Postgres that gives you that technology, the geospatial technology inside the core database itself. And what they found that it was more feature-rich and faster than all the other database technologies when it comes to geospatial processing. And then the open source licensing on there was just an added benefit because this system is going to be setting the standard for the world system, really. And the FAA intends to do that with their different IT systems, is that after they roll it out nationally, and the system is running nationally now, so as you get on a plane, your life depends on Postgres. It's also going to be rolled out globally as well. And so this way they had to look for the cost advantage as well. Because when they recommend the system out to places, say like in Zimbabwe or other places as well, it's going to have to be able to fit those budget needs in places where they don't have the same budget the United States does or the UK does or EU. So that's a key piece. And then as they were rolling it out, they started pushing it into other areas as well. Of a number of other projects, and it's becoming more of a mandate that every project that you do, they have to at least consider Postgres. It's not a mandate that they have to use it, but they have to at least consider it and find out why you use something else because they had so much success with it already. So what specifically they're running? They're running it on Solaris. It's in their main data centers. I think the data centers are in Atlantic City, and I think Denver are the key data centers. They are using the various different store procedure languages. Postgres has some nice, cool features in it that you can write in multiple store procedure languages. Ed mentioned about PL/SQL store procedures, which is great for Oracle users, but that's half the market. The other half has other abilities of writing your store procedures in Perl or Java or Tickle or Ruby or you name it. There's probably about 20 different store procedure languages. The FAA is specifically using Perl just because they have Perl developers and they need some of the power of Perl to be able to do some of those things. And as those databases get bigger and bigger, they're going to bolt on another technology called GridSQL, which adds an MPP-like architecture on top of that. So this way they can scale it. We talked about horizontal scaling. GridSQL gives you the ability to scale it out horizontally and be able to parallelize that database across many nodes. Like I said, it can horizontally scale, but it's not going to give you something like just bolting on nodes like Rack does. This gives you the ability, similar to a Teradata and a Netezza, to be able to give a data warehouse at open source prices.
Is that like partitioning?
Yeah, it's going to hash partition across a number of different nodes, and then you could also, the individual tables, you could partition by range or list or whatever you'd like on the individual nodes themselves. Sony Online Entertainment, this was a pretty cool game. We've been working with them for a number of years. They do the massive multiplayer online gaming. So this way you get thousands of users all walking around the world. This was kind of fun being able to play with a company called it's a game called Free Realms. It's really targeted at the 8 to 12-year-olds. So it's on Nickelodeon and Disney Channel, so you have kids that age. My son, who's just turns 10 today, is a real hero in his school because it says, Dad worked with the developers over at Free Realms, so he's like Mr. Popular going around school. But the difference with this game is that it's a free game, and they charge you by microtransactions. Similar concept to iTunes. So you're buying a game for 99 cents. Here you're going to buy access to a world for $1. You're going to buy a new Sword of Paradise or whatever for a couple dollars. The real key is you got thousands of concurrent users, all these kids going around there. They're going to talk their parents into letting them get $10 to buy it on different things, and they're going to get that Sword of Paradise, and they don't want to lose that data. And they traditionally, Sony has backed up everything through an Oracle database because it's a great database in order to be able to handle that stuff. But being able to deploy that application globally became cost prohibitive, especially for the business model. They wanted to do a low cost, handing it out for free, and doing microtransactions. It didn't work out financially to be able to get the bigger Oracle licensing to be able to do that. So they backed it with Postgres, allowing them to scale this out and try a new business model, which has been amazingly successful for them. This is a cool one that happened several years ago. It talks to Ed's database augmentation. FTD, handing out flowers. Their big 2 times of the year are Valentine's Day and Mother's Day. Right? So Valentine's Day has a huge peak the day before Valentine's Day, because all the guys are buying it. They're always procrastinating. It's like I do. Buy everything the last day. So they have a real big spike on one day. Mother's Day is more spread out over the course of a week or two, because the women are buying the flowers for the mothers and everybody else, and it's kind of more of a gradual process. But what they did is they implemented, I guess it's about 3 years, 2007, 3 years ago, they implemented a new system where their vendors, the florists, were able to go check the reports of what the orders they have to do. Their entire FTD.com site is running on Oracle. And when they rolled that out for Valentine's Day, they started in January, worked fine. Valentine's Day, all those reports was affecting the performance of the main site, so they shut it down and made all the reports run manually in the background, and people weren't happy. The key is that they had to fix that for Mother's Day, which was going to be a bigger problem. Over the course of weeks, they couldn't stay up straight for weeks in order to be able to do that. So they had to fix it between the course of Valentine's Day and Mother's Day. Natural thing, go to Oracle, say we're going to replicate from one Oracle database to another. Works perfectly fine. The problem is the expense of doing that was way outside their budget. They're on the order of hundreds of thousands of dollars to be able to do that. Found EnterpriseDB, replicated from Oracle to EnterpriseDB's Postgres Plus Advanced Server. Pointed their Oracle reports instances at Advanced Server because of the Oracle compatibility. Everything was up and going in 6 weeks. That's what we mean by database augmentation. FTD.com, still running on Oracle. All their vendor reports running on Postgres. So this way it's able to supplement that main Oracle database. The main data is still there. They're able to do it in such a way without blowing out their budget, and they're able to do other projects as well.
Okay. Great, thanks, Jimmy. So that wraps up the presentation part. What I'd like to do is, we'll open it up for Q&A.
Before we do the Q&A, I just want to do a quick thank you to our sponsors, and of course, thank you to our great speaker, Ed and Jim. First off is Oracle for this wonderful space that we have today. We also have Microsoft Online Business Productivity Suite, so we actually covered the entire gamut of database people. There's Vork, the Enterprise Framework for PHP, Dunlop Sport, HP's iPack, and 101 free tech books. So without further ado, let's start with questions.
I have 2 questions. Regarding what you said regarding MySQL community, the negative things about it, if that really was the case, don't you think that there would be a really popular fork of it? If all the negative things were really that negative?
It's a great question. We'll let the
I'll
expert.
just jump in. So I think how many of you have actually fixed a bug in MySQL and had it committed back and it made it into the next branch? So it was, actually one of the things that Sun really wanted to change about MySQL, make it more contribution friendly. There are 2 very challenging forks out there. One is by Monty, so it's MariaDB, and it is a fork of MySQL. It's growing. There's also a company by the name of Percona that is actually growing that one. And then the other one, which is kind of on the other end of the spectrum, is Drizzle. Have any of you heard of Drizzle?
Yeah.
So it is a complete fork of MySQL. With a BSD-style license for the new contributions, and it's a bunch of the old MySQLers really way back in the day before Sun acquired it. You should go take a look at that too. So what they did was they stripped out. They said compatibility doesn't matter. We're going to do all the things that end users care about, and then grow that. So
Drizzle is not owned by Oracle. It's not part of MySQL.
So actually, it was part of the acquisition. So any of the IP, the employees were Sun Microsystems employees and MySQL employees that started Drizzle. So any of the IP that came in prior to the legal entity combination is all Oracle IP. But all the contributions, so it's kind of GPL, all the contributions came in as BSD. So most of it is open source, and they can build the fork because of the open source license. But Oracle didn't own, or Sun did not own. It was joint contributions, and didn't own the copyright for all of that stuff.
I think too, one of the other points to make is it's not, just because people spin an open source community, it doesn't mean it becomes prolific, highly supported. I mean, look at, you can use the Postgres community as an example. I mean, 15 years, 15 years of weight behind that, and another 5 years in academia before that. Open source communities take a lot of time to develop and to mature. You can't wrap yourself in open source, clothes and say, you're going to succeed. And I think that's another, just another practical side of how projects kind of evolve and emerge. I think it's one of the reasons we see today the adoption of Postgres is accelerating now because people trust the maturity of the community itself and can rely on the fact that it's well enough established to support ongoing needs. I think it's harder to pull that off with other things, as derivatives. You see it as evidenced by Karen's describing.
I'd have to go on record. I would also say the Drizzle project, while it's very interesting, I would put it closer to the user base who would go after a NoSQL database because it's just so feature lean and it's not really comparable even to the base MySQL. It's probably closer to some of these people are considering NoSQL but want to keep that Excel styles table-like structure.
And the second question is regarding horizontal scaling. You mentioned that there is no features that's similar to RAG. Why? Is there no demand for it, no requirement, especially now with growing cloud computing? You can't truly scale on Amazon. The biggest system you can get is something like Quad 4. So you can't really grow it vertically as big. And putting all your eggs in one basket, getting one or two really big database servers, if one goes down, you lose 50% capacity, whereas if you scale horizontally, a bunch of small ones, if one goes down, you lose only 10% of your capacity. Don't you think that there is really...
Sure. Well, I do think there is Moore's Law that's growing. So today you can get Amazon's instances with 8 and 16 cores. And I believe that's going to grow to some degree. But it does limit you to a certain degree. And there is demand for rack in an open source space. There are projects out there in the Postgres world, things like Postgres R. There's other things spinning up like Postgres XE of horizontal scalability. Thing is, it took Oracle really about a decade to come to the point they are with Oracle RAC, with a lot of funding behind it, and you're trying to do that in an open source manner. It's not that it's not a goal of some people within the community itself to do that. It's just a hard problem to solve. And if you think about the number of applications out there that require that type of horizontal scalability, so the maximum thing for, say, an EC2 instance is 16 CPUs and 68 gig of RAM. That covers a large number of the applications out there in the world. It's like scaling beyond that. It's a very small fraction, so you're going to get a lot less community interest driving around that. So you're going to get small pockets of people, but you're not necessarily going to get thousands of people who require, sometimes even PhDs in computer science to be able to solve a difficult problem like that of horizontal scalability. So EnterpriseDB is working with NTT and other groups to be able to help solve that problem. But from an EnterpriseDB perspective, it's something that we want to look at, but it's not the main focus of our product development.
But I think it gets back to one part of your question. You know, when we talk to enterprise customers about the need for rack-like capability, what you find is it's actually quite narrow. You know, the use cases, you know, maybe, you know, expensive, but the volume of examples are pretty small in many enterprises. And so, you know, that I think gets back to what drives it. You know, demand drives it, and there hasn't been sufficient demand. With that said, you'll see this. It hasn't been formally announced, but the project's in the public domain now. NTT, one of their major projects, and with EnterpriseDB for the past year, was to work on Postgres-X, X-ray, XC, Charlie, XC, which is exactly what you asked about, you know, around Postgres. You know, it's rack-like capability in an open source project. So that's just been released. I think it's up. You know, it'll be formally announced probably in another month.
So it's going to be announced that it's production ready, or that
No,
development starts?
the development has started, but we're downstream on development. You know, I would say we're not at. It's not clearly at, you know, at 1.0 yet, but it's not far. You know, maybe between 6 and 12 months away from that, depending on how active the community gets.
I have two questions also. First is Grid SQL. Did you invent that technology, or is that like your own proprietary technology, or?
Good question. It's a project sponsored by EnterpriseDB. It is an open source project. The guys that run that project work for EnterpriseDB. Maybe Jimmy could talk a little bit more about it.
Yeah, it came out of a company called ExtendDB that's been around for a number of years, and they became part of EnterpriseDB. And when we had that acquisition, we open sourced the code as a GPL license, put it out there, giving people the ability to have that in the open source domain.
So that's sort of like your data warehousing technology add-on to Postgres. Is this Grid SQL?
Right. And there's a number of other technologies out there in the Postgres community. Things like Astrodata, Greenplum, Netezza, Vertica, all of them Postgres based. That's the only one that's fully open source. And
Okay, so there are a lot of different data warehousing platforms.
That's right. They're built up based on Postgres, but those are closed source,
right.
You know, now proprietary offerings.
Right.
You know, the roots for Postgres.
Okay.
But GridSQL is an open source project.
Okay. All right. That was my second question. How many data warehousing extensions are there? Okay. All right. Thank you.
Sure.
Questions? And
This one here.
So, I mean, we've talked about clustering from a performance point of view. I've had my own Postgres over the years. I mean, I looked at it like 5 years ago, about 3 years ago, and then kind of circling back and looking at it now. One of the challenges always we found was that in the open source realm, there wasn't a lot of offerings around replication and high availability and clustering in that aspect. I mean, there seemed to be like companies that were building proprietary solutions using Postgres underpinnings. I mean, has that changed? You know, where do you see like high availability replication in the open source realm? I don't know.
Yeah, and that's actually the biggest feature coming in Postgres 9.0, which is in like beta 4 at this point, coming out. Should be GA sometime in the summer. Is integrated replication, which they call streaming replication inside the core. So this way, you turn on the config file and you give it the IP address of the other server. It's going to start replicating over there, and then you're going to have a read-only slave sitting there replicating to that. And that's why they're making it such a big major jump, is that it's such a key feature inside there. So it's going to be inside the core of Postgres. You're still going to have all the other replication technologies you could have on top of that. But it's now going to be fully supported inside the core by the core community itself.
When is that release coming GA?
The community answer is when it's done, but probably July, August time frame.
Okay.
next question.
I'm from Sybase World, so when I first looked at this thing, there's a lot of like hourly snapshots. Something most highly transaction systems they rely on hourly snapshot for the data. So does this Postgres has got that kind of feature like hourly snapshot of data on databases?
You mean more like materialized
view?
view?
Like in most of the production systems, they rely on like one particular day, one particular time, the hourly snapshot. That's what I've seen most of the Sybase systems.
Oh, for replication?
Yes.
Well, what you could do is you could have your standby system kind of lag a little bit. Maybe Robert actually knows, he's sitting in the background there. He's one of the key Postgres guys from OmniDI, works on some pretty high performance type systems.
Yeah, so there's a number of different solutions. The one that's mostly built in is actually kind of similar to Oracle, where you use just transaction logs and you ship those over to a slave, and then sort of depending on how you want to configure it, you can either have those delay or not to be reapplied on other machines, and you can do that to one machine or multiple machines. So it's an asynchronous process, but not like an hourly snapshot. It's per transaction.
Okay. If I may extend that question, so do you have the functionality of being able to replay that transaction log to a specific point in time? So more for the point of view of recoverability.
Yeah,
so you go back to
you can go to a specific transaction ID or time, and it's configurable.
But that's what I've seen, like most of the Wall Street, entirely Sybase, they definitely look to have that as something new tool.
Yeah, and the way the point-in-time recovery and wall shipping works, it's the Postgres community's philosophy is to be flexible and let the user decide on how they do that. So when you're shipping the logs across, you can essentially do that through a shell script. And in that shell script, you could say, wait for an hour, and once an hour, move it over there and let the slave replay it at that once an hour. So you could script it to do that very easily to do that because of the flexibility of Postgres to do that.
But that's very different than going back in time, saying I want to go back 20 hours and see what happened.
Well, you don't have flashback query.
That's okay. So that was my question. So that is not available.
Right. You have the ability to delay those logs.
Yeah, you can decide that I'm going to always have an hour back, but you can't sort of dynamically go back.
It's worth mentioning. So if you have a base backup of a Postgres database and you keep the transaction logs available, right, that you've done any point in time from that base backup up to your latest transaction log, you can take that and put it on the system and roll forward to specific points in times or transactions. So you can do it that way. It's not
right. There's a lot of manual work involved in that, sure.
But yeah, but you do have the ability to actually sort of go back in time if you need to, if you've kept those records around.
Okay, thanks.
How's backup typically done? Does Postgres plug into every backup technology that's out there on the market that you use?
Yeah, it's very flexible about that. It's really based on that same technology with the wall shipping and point-in-time recovery of being able to take that base backup and you're going to be able to store that basically the way you would XML files or Word documents. You're going to say, start backup, similar to how Oracle used to do it back in the day before RMAN. Back up everything, get your transaction logs, and say stop backup. You actually do the stop backup, then get your transaction logs. But that'll plug into a Veritas, a Tivoli, or plug into any sort of the backup utilities that you want to be able to run.
Questions?
Yes. Let me ask you a little bit of a dangerous question in some ways. When you start talking to people either in the startup space, which is very vibrant in New York, or even in well-established companies who do use open source, typically they think in terms of the AMP stack. Okay? Why do you feel that Postgres hasn't made it as part of their mind space? I mean, over the last couple of months, I've probably attended a couple of dozen meetings. I haven't heard Postgres mentioned other than in this meeting. I've talked to at least 2 or 3 dozen startup developers and CTO types. Postgres is not part of their mind space. I was at a meeting on Monday that was kind of a training session for people in dynamic web pages, and what was being discussed was MySQL and PHP.
So I think there's a couple of reasons. I mean, one is if you look at the evolution of the PHP specifically and the LAMP stack, that there was an early association and an appropriate association between MySQL as a good enough database if you're a PHP developer, and that got hardened into the LAMP stack. And I think the popularity of MySQL, I think even Karen would agree, popularity of MySQL grew up around that that technology stack. And frankly, at the same time, there are a lot of things in the Postgres world one, wasn't focused on that use case. That wasn't the design orientation of Postgres, and so the guys in the community didn't view that as a negative. It just, wasn't the emphasis of Postgres. I mean, some other little known facts: Postgres didn't have a build for a Windows machine until 2 years ago. When was the Windows build done?
It's about 5-6 years ago.
Okay, so 5 years ago. But if you kind of dial the clock back far enough, most developers are writing applications, on a Windows box, and MySQL is there, Postgres wasn't there. So I think that's a legacy reason why it just hasn't been associated with, that style of application. I think the other one, realistically, is until we decided to focus the commercial energy around how do we socialize the technology into these other communities of interest, the Postgres community core team is really focused on the core technology. The extra work that goes into it, this is maybe an advantage for a commercial entity who's really worried about making sure the ecosystem forms around the technology. The Postgres community has been focused on making sure it's just an extraordinarily good technology. How that plays into other communities, is defined by others in other communities. And we feel like one of our important roles to play going forward is to help socialize the technology into these other communities of interest.
And make it easier. So it wasn't until, December, or in 2008, give me the exact date, but we built these one-click installers, right? So the Java developers really do like Postgres a lot, but it was just kind of too hard to go get that basic app up and running. And so EnterpriseDB built one-click installers that you can now find from the community. Give all that to the community. You can go download it, and literally with a one-click install, you can get up and running. And that's what the PHP developer looks for and wants, and was one of the reasons why MySQL was so successful in getting the developer mind share. And so we, as the commercial entity, as Ed said, we're going to go after that big time.
So you're changing, I'm sorry, somebody else says. Well, I was just saying, my perspective and what I've heard from the market is Postgres was more Oracle replacement, compete against Oracle replacement. And as you stated, not the use case of where MySQL is. It sounds like now you want to shift and say, we're going where MySQL is.
I wouldn't go that far. I think the point is Postgres can work very well with with dynamic languages. It wasn't positioned to do that well. It wasn't trumpeted that was a strength, but it actually can and does perform well with that style of application. But no one talks about it. No one points that out. We'll point that out. I think it's a strong statement to say we're going to chase that. As EnterpriseDB, go after that workload. We do find a lot of companies now coming to us, raising their hands, asking about this. So we think it's an important place for us to focus our attention. I would say generally, because of the inherent association of the style of database Postgres is, it works really, really well with guys writing Java style apps. So it's a more natural fit. And that's a pretty big hill to overcome. The core association between PHP and MySQL. You'll start to see that change. It'll take some time. I think given Oracle's control of the technology, we're already starting to feel the pressure, to answer these kind of questions. Why hasn't it been more relevant till date? And I think that'll continue to change. People want this independent option, and that's, I think, bringing Postgres more forward in that workload environment.
Last question. I did your hand up.
I've been working with MySQL for a number of years, and I've also encountered Postgres and worked in shops that used Oracle, and it seems like Postgres comes up, but it's usually as kind of a threat. Like the Oracle, or like the manager brings it up, it's like we want to reduce the Oracle cost, and they bring up Postgres, or they want to increase the security of their data, and so it's a threat against MySQL. How do you plan to make it not be like a threat, but just be an obvious choice that people know about and sort of like aren't afraid of it being more difficult to use, or like it's just as easy as MySQL? Or
So it's a good question, and I'll give you a couple of thoughts. Maybe you guys can pile on. One way is doing meetings like this, right? being more present, talking about the technology, more, on a more regular basis, with the community and independent of the community, just engaging in the dialogue and the discussion. Another is to continue to point our commercial resources at the positioning, branding, and profiling of Postgres as a project. This is an example of doing that. We continue to do more work like that. And then I think from a technology perspective, we spend a lot of time, what inherently we're doing in Postgres Plus is we're addressing certain things that we know companies want to deal with that when you get the community distribution you don't get. An automated update service, simpler management tools, built-in management monitoring and reporting, things that the community won't focus on, we'll focus on. So it makes it a little more mainstream. I think companies are always going to pick open source technologies, whether we say anything or not, as an offset. That arguments case, that's become a norm in enterprise, and I think it's healthy. I think that continues. Making it the obvious choice is, groundswell of work, doing work like this, getting guys like you all to say, we really should be paying attention to Postgres. I don't know if that helped. You guys have other point of view on that?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is just getting the word out of who else is using Postgres. Like Ed said, there's lots of people using Postgres, but they're not out there talking about it. One of our big things that we're trying to do as a company is gather all that information and get the word out. Before everybody would be on the community using their Gmail or Yahoo accounts, you wouldn't necessarily know that the FAA is using Postgres unless EnterpriseDB is there telling everybody. So like Red Hat was as that conversion point for Linux, EnterpriseDB has to be that conversion point around Postgres for the stories of getting it out there. Because when you find out that other companies similar to yourself is doing something with Postgres, you're going to feel more comfortable going ahead and doing it, using Postgres as opposed to just using it as a threat, because you know it'll work in your industry.
We have time for one more.
So, as a long time user of both Oracle, MySQL, and Postgres, and mainly with the business intelligence like workload, I'm missing the functionality that's present in Oracle since version 8.16, I guess, so-called analytic functions. And I guess that's probably a big pain point for many others with BI use cases. Do you see anything in that department coming?
Yeah, well, that's actually been in Postgres for about a year now. The analytic functions are there, and that's in 8.4 it started. First one in there, and then now in 9.0 it's another improvement to it. So it is there. I should go check it out again.
That's great. The other one is that on the GUI end, what's available and whatnot. I haven't checked on how Postgres from this point for last year or so.
Yeah, from a basic DBA type tool, DGAdmin 3, very similar to things like Toad, for instance, a graphical user tool in order to be able to access your database. There's a number of other tools out there, PHP, PGAdmin, so if you want to be able to have that based in, say, a web server, so this way if you have something hosted and you want to have those GUI tools on top of that, you have that there as well. And there's a lot of other commercial distributions around Postgres that have tools like SQL Manager, PG Lightning, and there's a number of other ones that are more like the $100 tools. They base their company just on building tools on top of Postgres. So there's a number of options out there, green, open source, and commercial.
I want to thank everybody for coming. I want to thank Ed for this exceptional presentation. EnterpriseDB, I want to thank Kim Marie for this wonderful use of Oracle space and providing pizza, which I believe there is some leftover, might be a little cold, but it's there for you guys if you want it. And it will be up here if anyone wants to have more questions. Thank you.